Good evening, good morning, good night, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome. My name's Alex Rafalowicz. I'm the co-director of global program at 350.org. And tonight, where I am, which is on Muisca country, which is in Bogota in Colombia, I'm really excited to be having a conversation with two incredibly inspiring leaders who have thought a lot about the moment that we're in right now. And we are in a scary moment wherever we are in the world, facing an unprecedented global epidemic, and simultaneously knowing that we are facing the climate crisis at an ever-increasing scale of destruction and terror for many, many people across our world. So it's a very important moment at this time to reflect on how did we get to this situation where we're facing multiple crises at the same time, and where can we find sources of hope? And I'm really excited to start a conversation here with Dr. Ilaria Capua, who's a renowned Italian virologist. In 2006, she upended the existing paradigm in the research community by sequencing the genome of the H5N1 virus, which you might know as the avian influenza, and making it publicly accessible. The type of brave, public-focused action that at 350.org we love and admire. And she currently heads up the One Health Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and recently published a book in English called Circular Health by the Bocconi University Press. And this book was originally published in Italian, but it was prescient of the time and the crisis that we're facing now, and so has been translated into English and will be a part of the basis of our discussion. We also have May Boeve, who is originally from Sonoma County in California, and is currently the executive director of the global climate action organization 350.org. May has organized for climate across the world and focuses on centering the intersections between climate action and climate justice and movements for change in all corners of our globe. So I'm not going to be talking very much after this, and I'm going to invite Dr. Capua to give us an introduction to your recently published book, of the many books that you have published.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Alex and to May for being here and for hosting this digital talk. And thank you to Elastica, who organized this. They have done a very, very good job. And we're 10 presentations down the road, so thank you. And it's Thanksgiving week, right? In the United States, it's Thanksgiving, so we should be thankful for being here and for being safe and healthy. So yeah, I have, as you know, I have a presentation that I am happy to share with you. And you can see my full screen. Is this correct, Alex?
It is. I'm giving you a thumbs up. I might be hidden. Yes, we can see your screen.
The full screen, not the partial screen.
It looks full to me, yeah. The evolution of health.
Yes. Okay. Okay. No, I think that, there you go. This is better, right?
No, I think what was the first thing was the best thing.
Okay, there you go then. Okay, so anyway, I will talk to you about the evolution of health, and I will try to convince you of how we have had a circular approach to health at the very start, and have now, with no data at all, and we have now instead, with very, very much data, we have a completely different approach to health that can actually change many, many things of how we see health and how we look at health in the future. So I don't think I'm still sharing my screen. Is this correct?
You're not. Yeah. If you'd like to share now, so.
There you go. Sorry. So let me start from here. And this is...
You're still not sharing. I don't
okay,
know.
okay. Then I'm going to have to... Am I sharing now?
No. Do whatever you did right at the very beginning.
Forget about the sharing, this screen sharing. So many years ago, when the ancient philosophers started thinking about health and what health looked like, they came up with this diagram. Next slide. I think that, yes, with this diagram that represents health. If we look at this diagram, next slide, you will see that at the center of health, there are three words. And those three words are world with all its creatures, time, and man. And so already at the beginning of the development of the concept of health, it was clear that human beings, time, and the world were at the heart of health. Next. Now, how did this theory, which consisted of looking at health as one system, how did innovation allow the system to expand? It allowed the system to expand through disruption. And disruption always came from a different discipline. So one of the first disruptive innovators that we have had, or one of the ones that I talk about in this book, is Andrea Vesalius, who broke the barrier of bringing art into science. And by breaking this barrier, he made science more accessible and accessible to many, many people. And if you look at these drawings, you will see that the perspective that he brought into his drawings made a completely different image of what he was trying to represent, and therefore made it more accessible. Next slide. Another great and disruptive innovator was Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope. This guy used Galileo's lenses in upside down or backwards, and suddenly realized that there was a microscopic world. That microscopic world did not exist until this guy believed that world existed and used lenses to explore that world. And nobody believed him, because at the time, you could only believe in what you could see. And just think of how stupid it looks to us nowadays to think that there couldn't have been an invisible world. Of course there was an invisible world. Everything has an invisible dimension, right? But at those times, this was absolutely against the dominating theory. And this inventor of the microscope was actually, he was a tailor, and he worked in a shop that had textiles. And the reason for looking into using these lenses was because he wanted to look at what he was feeling. So the textiles, the soft textiles, or the resistant textiles needed to be appreciated also with another sense, which is by looking at them. But he couldn't see the difference. And by using these lenses, he discovered not only he wanted to see what he wanted to see, but he discovered the invisible world, which included, as you can see, these are his drawings. He didn't have cameras. He didn't have anything. So sperm, sand, the ones with a yellow background are protozoa, the first small animals that he saw, and then, of course, insects. Next. The next great disruptive innovator that I want to talk about, who broke a series of barriers into making the people of the time understand the human-animal link, is Jenner. Jenner was brave enough to take a disease of animals, an ugly, horrible disease of animals, and use it to vaccinate that little baby, which is held in the hands of the woman. And look at the cartoon below. Look at how they were making fun of Jenner and how they were making fun of this disgusting experiment. So this was a truly disruptive innovation, which brings us today to the world of vaccines, because without that intuition, without that brave, without that, I would say, attentive and brave observation, maybe we would be in a different place. Next. Here you see even better how Jenner was ridiculed and was offended by the pictures of the comics of the time. But this makes you understand how the general public perceives at times this type of very, very brave public health measure. Next. Next. And the last disruptive innovator I will talk about, and I talk about in the book, is Jon Snow. Jon Snow was the first guy to figure out with a map. A map had never been used to understand a disease. And he pulled a map out of his bookcase, looked at the map of London, and understood that the pump, the water pump, was the connecting link of the cholera epidemic. And he wasn't believed either. And actually, I don't know if anyone has heard this story as well, that his the first paper that he wrote up around cholera and that he tried to publish was rejected because nobody believed him. And so here is another disruptive innovator who discovered waterborne diseases, and of course, nobody was ready to take that. Next. So here we are with the scheme that I showed at the start. And we go back to that drawing that has at the center the world, the time, and humans. But in periphery, it has some other words that are, for example, terra, next. And the ancients had understood that the health of people is connected to the health of earth, of soil, of the products of soil, of the products of animals, of the animals that coexist with us. The ancient philosophers had also thought that our health was interconnected with water. And of course, water is not only what brings cholera, but water is what we need to survive, is where the fish and oceans are located inside water. And water is a finite resource. Next. But also air. Our health is strictly dependent on the air we breathe. Also, because air offers a space to travel, and travel has been an extremely important driver of this pandemic. Next, and also something that is very dear to 350.org, fire. Fire as climate change and the increase of temperature worldwide, not only in the air on Earth, but also in water. But the world is burning. Fire is burning our resources. And so the question that I raise in this book, and that is even more urgent to face, more urgent to address now that we are in the post-COVID environment, is next. Can't we use big data? Can't we to put all these bits together and look at health as a system? Is this not the time to use big data, not only to sell us our favorite gadgets, not only to understand our preferences, but is it not time to start using information that we generate with our phones, with our devices, and with our uh, our capacity to measure? Because we are measuring this pandemic, right? This is clear. We know everything around, every measurement around the pandemic. So why don't we use it? Because we can use it to advance health as a system. Next. This is the real opportunity we have. This is the real opportunity that COVID-19 brings as we look at co-advancing the health of humans, animals, plants, and the environment as one system. This is the challenge that we have. This is the challenge that COVID-19 brings us. And now is the time to do it, because we are in a moment in which there are new pathways that need to be explored, and we need to be brave to push these pathways towards sustainability, because let's say a window of opportunity like now, I don't think is going to come back very easily. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that run through. I mean, the book, in the book, you talk about health as a universal asset and talk about its needing to agree on our interconnections and interdependencies if we're going to really address public health crises. And one of those interdependencies, of course, is the environment. We can't continue to pollute, invade, abuse, and extract from the environment as if it's our exclusive property. So there's one of the quotes in the book that stuck with me, and I wonder, May, if you'd like to reflect on that and think about these intersections between how we treat the environment, the health crisis, and the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And Ilaria, thank you for your inspiring work. And I'm so glad to have an opportunity to talk across the health climate intersection. And I think one of the things that really strikes me about your work is one of the things that really drew me to climate activism in the first place, which is that by understanding the underlying causes of the climate crisis, there's actually a tremendous opportunity to build the kind of society that we actually would want to see. And as Alex was saying, the drivers of the climate crisis really are, at some fundamental level, taking too much from what has been given in terms of our planetary health, and often redistributing who has that, to taking from people who don't have enough and giving it to those who already have a lot. And one of the things that we've been so struck by in the COVID pandemic is just the vast inequality in our society that it exposes. And it reminds us of what we see with climate change. As mentioned, I live in California, and we're dealing with record-breaking forest fires every year. But who really bears the brunt of the impacts of these forest fires? It's the communities who have the fewest resources to actually respond to an emergency. And when we look at the map of the pandemic, we see a similar pattern. Who are the groups that are most impacted by the disease? It is people of color, it is women, it is the elderly. So we see these trends not only in terms of the underlying drivers, but also who feels the impacts themselves. And we have been very focused since the pandemic began on this question of, is this some kind of dress rehearsal or litmus test for how humanity deals with the climate crisis? Because we've seen in the pandemic a tremendous awakening of a lot of people around the world about how one thing that happens in one place ultimately affects what happens everywhere. And even if the pandemic, struck in certain places first, it eventually impacted everyone in the world. And there was this moment, and we're still in it, where everyone was facing the same problem together. And for those of us who have been fighting climate change, we see the climate crisis the same way, that what happens in one country impacts absolutely everyone else. It doesn't matter if you're burning coal in South Africa or China or New York City, it's going to infect all of us ultimately through the impacts of climate change. So in the sense of this dress rehearsal, if the way that we as a society respond to the pandemic is in some ways better, better than we've responded to pandemics in the past, are there clues there for how we therefore address climate change? So we've been part of an effort to call for principles for a just recovery from COVID that put people's health first, that make sure the needs of the most vulnerable are dealt with immediately, but that also rebuild our economy in such a way that relies more on the types of energy sources that don't drive climate change, the kinds of politics that don't empower authoritarians. You know, what are the principles out of our recovery from COVID that are going to actually help us think about other future crises? So there are many, many connections to be made, not only between health and science and climate, but also all of those themes and the economy and how we're all impacted. I think that's part of why this pandemic has been so life-changing for so many people and so horrifying for so many people who are suffering from it.
Yes, I have to say that I agree with you. This is the pandemic of inequalities and you know, everything is just coming back. So we knew that there were certain things that were just needed fixing. And I think that as a global community, the global community was ready to start talking about it, but not to start fixing it. And the COVID-19 has, I think, accelerated that urge. It has made fixing certain problems more urgent. And as you say, we have a window of opportunity, which is extremely important, because we could actually start doing things in a completely different way. We have attention from decision makers. We have decision makers and governments that are looking for ideas, because this is a unique pandemic, and it will leave behind it a completely transformed planet. And so I think that what we have to do is ensure that the just recovery, as you say, in the rebuild phase, builds a more resilient society. So a society that is able to absorb and that is able to react and that does not collapse under a stress test like COVID-19, because COVID-19 has made the society, many aspects of it, just collapse.
In talking about the changes that need to be made, I wonder if you could each kind of reflect on do you see one or two really pressing first things that need to happen in response to the current crisis that will set us up better for both the next potential pandemic, as well as giving us the resilience to confront the underlying ecological crisis?
So I can give you an example, and I can actually make a comparison with what happened 14 years ago. So you mentioned this when you introduced me. In 2006, I ignited a debate on sharing of genetic data of viruses in the pre-pandemic phase, so before they become pandemic, right? So my obvious idea was that if veterinarians who were doing surveillance in the animal reservoir could were empowered to share this information with the medical community and the community of people who are on the other side of the spillover, this could have allowed a better response, more diagnostics and more tests and better vaccines. So at that time, there was no mechanism of sharing the genetic information. And I was fortunate enough to have a sequence of a virus that like everybody was really interested in. And so I said, look, I have this sequence. I could put it in a password protected database, which is what was the existing infrastructure that everybody used. But I said, I don't think this is fair and I don't think this is reasonable, because like if there's going to be a pandemic, it's going to be everybody's problem. And so we should share this and put this in an open access repository, which I did. And this created a lot of discussion, a lot of international discussion, and it caused me personally a lot of trouble. But we now, 14 years later, we have a series of databases that contain about over 150,000 sequences of COVID-19 in those same databases, right? So an infrastructure which was developed 15 years ago, and they played around with it because, you know, you need to work with it, has now become the power engine of vaccines, diagnostics, right, okay? Okay, so now we have to go one step beyond, okay? We have to work on creating an infrastructure which will enable our generation, but especially generation after us, to populate that infrastructure so that Generation Z, when they will be in front of their quantum computers or whatever they'll have, they will have the information in there that they can use. And it will be information that will be curated, will be validated, will also, you know, be used in the meantime to look for, you know, whatever. And I am talking about creating a repository of data that relates to environmental variables like weather and pollen and temperature and using this data to look at major trends and using the excuse of COVID, because COVID is so everywhere. It's like you're right. I mean, it is so similar to climate change because it affects everyone, right? So you can actually do the associations with so many different things because COVID is as it has permeated so many spaces, just like. And so my hope is that if I can convince stakeholders and people out there to understand that there is a circularity in health. So if we poison our oceans, that is not going to be good for our health, right? Okay, so it's as easy as that. We live in a closed system, right? And so we need to rediscover that circularity, and we need to do this by sharing information. And if we share information, even as people and as patients, to empower a better health for everyone, I am sure that we will be happy to do it. And we have the technology, so we need to start from somewhere. Let's take COVID as an excuse to start thinking about this let's say, new infrastructure, which obviously is going to be completely open as well.
I'm so glad that you took those risks in order to share the data so that we could be where we are. And I think it's such a beautiful example of how change actually happens when people decide to go against the grain for the good of everyone and take a little flack in the process, maybe, but ultimately over time see the change that was made. So I'm honored to be talking to you. It reminds me a lot of the solutions required to fight climate change as well. A lot of this is about sharing across borders, and particularly sharing across developed countries and developing countries when it comes to solutions to climate change. And we're approaching, just in a couple of days, the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement, which at the time was a very significant agreement because it represented so many countries. 195 were part of it. And it was at the time when there had not been a lot of multilateral agreements passed about anything. And here was this agreement passed about climate change. And it really required a lot of thinking about who has access to what information about the state of the problem, who has access to what information about the technology that's going to solve it, and how are those resources shared. So really and truly reminds me of what you said. And a lot of in answer to your question, Alex, about what would come first, one of the things we're paying attention to is, in this moment of tremendous rethinking that's going on about what happened pre-pandemic and what's going to happen after, we don't have to go back to the way things were. And that's not only true when it comes to health, that's true when it comes to the economy. And the climate crisis is very, very urgent. And if we continue to say, invest in fossil fuels as our main energy source coming out of this pandemic, we're taking all the wrong lessons from this experience. And if you look at the data, unfortunately, across all the G20 countries, 50% of the resources around recovery devoted to energy are going to coal, oil, and gas. It's the same business as usual thinking that got us into the climate crisis in the first place. So it's a very basic request in many respects, but we can't be bailing out the very industries that got us into this unequal climate change causing mess that we're in now. And that's where people power comes in. That's where people speaking up to their governments and saying, we need this kind of infrastructure for our health, and we need a different kind of infrastructure for our economy and for safety from the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think that let's say the major challenge is that everything that you said requires a lot of time, and just now there's like very, very urgent decisions that need to be taken, because like nobody was expecting something of this magnitude. And so I see where you're going, and I understand exactly. However, this is like an emergency with, it's not even a capital E, it's an E of the font 72, okay, compared to font 10. It's such an emergency. And so I do think, though, that the pandemic has highlighted that a certain type of mobility can be stopped or can be slowed down. And that's exactly where we have to go. We have to show that there is a different way of working together that will, of course, revolutionize certain systems, working systems as we know them. So, I mean, big office space in the middle of cities, is that still necessary? I don't think that is necessary. We are going to have to reconvert that space and find a way to make, people who work in it survive. But the changes that are coming are so big that we really need solutions to come from non-conventional domains. And we need to start having disruptive innovators go into those pathological loops that you describe and say, okay, why don't we do it, try and do it this other way? Because another thing that I would like to underline is that one of the things that we suffer most, I think, as our generation and the society we live in, is that the path of least resistance is so much easier. Like, it's so much easier. And so I think that now is the time to start looking at alternative pathways and abandon these easy solutions. Like, for example, I mean, one of the things that I don't care whether it's easy or not, or you know, it could be the most difficult thing in the world, but I don't think it's acceptable that we have not been able to use on a mass scale pesticides that don't kill helpful insects. I think this is a scandal. I mean, there must be a way around it. It's not possible that we still use those molecules that we know are dangerous for beneficial insects. And so certainly the fact that certain procedures, processes, and activities are well established, and we know their consequences, we know, has pushed us in this path of least resistance. But if we can send SpaceX from here, they send like a rocket in space every 3 weeks or something. They want to send people to Mars in a couple of years. I think we can find a pesticide that doesn't kill butterflies.
Yeah, I have no doubt about that. I think there's a lot of harmful technologies that we could eliminate the use of tomorrow if there were sufficient political will to do so. And you're absolutely right that there are cascading emergencies in this moment, and people's health and recovery and a vaccine is essential. And thank goodness that there's a little bit of good news coming out on that front in the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. I think what is striking is what kind of emergencies qualify to mobilize the kind of government resources that we've seen with the pandemic, and what sort of emergencies continue to be emergencies for years and years and years. And so we don't want the climate crisis, we don't want mass inequality, we want sexism and racism to be these sorts of emergencies that just go on and on, when we've seen how government, when it chooses, can mobilize resources in a flash. And I think for anyone who is advocating for some kind of change to the way we live, this has been such a remarkable time just to watch the speed at which government can act when it feels like there is truly an emergency facing it. And do we wish that there were not so many pressing emergencies? Absolutely. But for the people who are actually living through the impacts of those emergencies, they're very clear that they exist. And so we would only hope that aspect of public will matched with massive government spending, and really forcing corporations to do the will of the people at the behest of the government, that sweet spot of reaction that we're seeing right now in country after country is the kind of pattern we would hope to continue. And I think that's going to require sustained social movement pressure and sustained learning from the scientific community, and you name it. A lot of what's been mobilized in the past months or so of the pandemic, we're going to, unfortunately, some of that aspect of human energy and creativity will have to be channeled, hopefully, towards building solutions and not as much responding to crises.
Yeah, and I think that we need creative solutions. We really need to get people who are experts in completely different fields to position their idea and have other disciplines contribute to enriching that idea. And because we are suffering, and I think that, you know, the devastation that the pandemic has brought with it is also because we certainly missed. There are a few things that we missed, and we missed some big things, like we weren't prepared for a pandemic by an unknown virus. This is the truth. we thought that we were going to get a pandemic, that a pandemic would be 99% influenza, because we were prepared for influenza pandemic. And to be fair to us, the scientists, we had only had influenza pandemics, right, that we know of, right? The Spanish flu, and then all the other pandemics have been influenza pandemics. So we knew that there was these viruses coming and going from the animal reservoir, but none of them we had been able to stop them, right? But we hadn't planned for a virus that was efficient in transmitting from human to human, and that had no antibodies, and so there was no memory, and we knew nothing about it. And so I think that I'm sure that if it hadn't been only virologists speaking to each other, somebody would have said, but like, couldn't it be a virus that you don't know? And we would have said, but maybe it would have had something. So there's lots of things that I think we should learn from this pandemic. And certainly one thing that we must learn, I think there's two big take-home messages that link our two areas of expertise and into one area of convergence. The first one is that citizens have never been so careful about their health as they are now. And so this opens an enormous window of attention towards science. And citizens, as you say, can bring about change. And I think that working with citizens and through citizens to convey the message that there's only one direction that we can go in, which is the direction of sustainability. Like there's no plan B, and now we can either go back to where we were, or we can try and be somewhere else. And I think that this is one of the first convergences that I think, because through the interest in health and citizen empowerment, we can bring back, also because, you know, this pandemic has done a lot for climate and for pollution, because there's been all of this interest around how reduced mobility has impacted the quality of air and all the rest. And so people are interested and are curious. And that is the first thing. And the second thing I think is that we need to develop some new narratives which resonate better in the post-COVID environment, because there was a world before COVID and there's a world after COVID, and priorities have changed. And I think that priorities of big companies may have changed, and there may be a much greater attention to fulfilling their ESGs, their environmental and all the rest, and societal and governmental goals. So I think that there is a window of opportunity really to empower mechanisms for change. And this, I think, needs to be done by using interdisciplinarity, even if it's a little bit disruptive, because we need a bit of disruption.
Yeah, I actually wanted, perhaps as a bit of a closing question for you both, is, you know, I see you both as disruptors in your own way, in your own fields, and in society more broadly. And I was wondering if you could offer, and this is a bit more personal, some reflections about kind of what it feels like in that moment when you do ask the question that everyone thinks, has never even thought of asking, or thinks is a stupid question, and you feel like you're out there and exposed, because hopefully some of the folks who are listening today are thinking about ways that they might disrupt something that's going on in their community where they are. So I was wondering if you could both perhaps just reflect on that as a final thought for us.
Who goes first?
I'm still thinking. I'm happy to go first. So we'll give you the last word, Ilaria. Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of actually something you were just speaking to, Ilaria. I'm reminded of how I was feeling in the early days of the pandemic, and that sort of energy that arises within you when you're curious about something and you wonder if other people are having the same thought, but you haven't heard it said out loud, as Alex was saying. And the experience was of being asked repeatedly by, partner organizations and journalists, exactly what you were saying. Well, isn't the pandemic having some good news because it's reducing pollution? Because there were these statistics coming out about coal plants being shut down because economic activity was down and flying less and those things. And I got the question so many times, and it really sort of grated at me, because the disruption that I am most passionate about is convincing people that the climate crisis is about people. And yes, it's about charts and polar bears and ecosystems, but we as humans live in those ecosystems, and it's a human problem with human solutions. And I was very worried that this narrative would take hold, that somehow the environment was over here getting better and people over here were getting sick and dying from COVID. And how could those two realities coexist? And so I was feeling very animated in this experience and thinking, we have to say something about this. We have to actually push against this notion that you can, on the one hand, have a global health crisis affecting people, and that can somehow be good for the environment. And so that's what really, that was the seed that planted the work at 350.org that we ended up doing on a just recovery, is really thinking about how can we tell a different story about how the pandemic relates to climate change and people and the economy and rebuilding. And it's been a really interesting journey. But, to answer the question, I was a little nervous to put these ideas to other people, because I thought, is this going against a dominant view that's going to be dismissed? Am I going to feel silly for having this idea? Or will others be interested in it and want to do something together? And so for people who are watching this, who are thinking about in their own lives, a place where they feel disruption may be necessary, and are they the person to bring it about? That's a simple question, because the answer is yes. And very often what is needed is one person listening to their gut and listening to that little voice inside saying, maybe you should say something about this. Maybe you have something to share that has not been offered and that would move us all collectively forward. And if all of us listened to that urge and that voice, and found ways to join our voices with other people, we would see a lot of different transformative change in the world. So yeah, that's how I think about how an individual can be disruptive.
Well, I think that I am disruptive in nature, in that I nearly have like a mental loop that when I hear something, I immediately project it like in a mirror and see if it makes sense from another perspective. And now, as you see, I'm part of the aging population, as you see from my wrinkles. This has become very, very automatic. And so I live in a sort of dimension in which disruption is part of my thinking process. And it's actually fun. What is important is that you are aware that you can be disruptive, and you can be politely disruptive, which is very difficult, but is a skill, and is actually what I think brings the best results for everyone. And so, especially in a moment of uncertainty like the one we are experiencing, being politely disruptive and trying to see, like, when you feed seeds to birds, they say this bird, this redbirds, cardinals here, they like whatever. And you try and feed other seeds and see what happens. And so now is the time that many seeds can be planted and that can be taken up, and just they have to be seeds, not watermelons. And that wasn't me 20 years ago, right? You sort of grow up and you learn. But I think that, lateral thinking is extremely important today and is obviously often disruptive. But I welcome disruption if it is positive and it brings positive energy. If it's destructive, then no.
Thank you both for sharing that. I think ending on the idea of planting seeds is a lovely one in this time, to think of and hope for rebirth and growth. So thank you to Elastica for hosting these talks. Thank you to Ilaria and May for your time and reflections and energy and disruptions. Do check out their Circular Health book, which is now out in English by Bocconi University Press. And if you want to know more about 350's Just Recovery campaign, you can also check out our website, which is justrecovery.org, JUST recovery.org. Thank you all, and good evening, good day, good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to Giovanni and Margherita, who are not here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.